Sometimes the thing we run from becomes the very thing that saves us. Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than memory, Elena Vasquez crashed through the underbrush with rain-soaked hair clinging to her face and terror driving every desperate step. Behind her, Marcus, the man she'd once trusted with her heart, hunted her with the patience of something that had done this before, his voice echoing through the storm. "You can't hide from what you are, Elena." But Elena Vasquez wasn't just a trauma nurse fleeing an obsessed ex-boyfriend. For the past 6 months, she'd been experiencing vivid dreams of medieval courts, ancient battles, and the taste of blood on her lips, dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. When she'd discovered the tracking devices in her apartment, the hidden cameras, and the old leather journal filled with sketches of her face dating back decades, she'd finally understood that Marcus knew something about her that she didn't know about herself. Now, as lightning illuminated a stone castle that shouldn't exist in the Oregon wilderness, Elena faced a choice that would determine not just her survival, but her very soul. What happens when the monster you're running toward might be your only salvation from the monster chasing you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The castle loomed before Elena like a fever dream made manifest, its ancient stones defying everything she knew about Oregon's wilderness. Gothic spires pierced the storm clouds, and warm golden light spilled from arched windows that should have been dark ruins after centuries of Pacific Northwest weather. Yet here it stood, impossibly real, with the distant sound of a violin weaving through the thunder. Elena's rational mind, the same mind that had guided her through countless emergency room traumas, screamed that this was hypothermia-induced hallucination, but her bare feet were planted firmly on wet stone steps, and the iron-studded doors before her radiated warmth she could feel through the torrential rain. Behind her, Marcus's voice cut through the storm again, closer now. "Elena, you don't understand what you're walking into." She spun around, her soaked scrubs clinging to her shivering frame. Through the sheets of rain, she could make out his silhouette moving between the massive Douglas firs with unnatural grace. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of something metallic in his hand, something that definitely wasn't a phone or car keys. The dreams crashed over her again, unbidden. A great hall filled with figures in medieval dress, the weight of a crown on her head. Blood, always blood, warm and intoxicating against her lips, and eyes pale as winter frost, watching her with an intensity that had haunted her sleep for months. "My queen," a voice from those dreams whispered in her memory. "You will return to me." Elena stumbled backward toward the castle doors, her nursing badge catching on the ancient iron handle. The practical plastic rectangle looked absurd against the ornate metalwork, a jarring reminder of the life she'd built in Portland. 12-hour shifts at Providence Medical Center, her small apartment overlooking the Willamette River, the coffee shop where she'd met Marcus 8 months ago, where he'd seemed like salvation from her loneliness. All of it felt like someone else's life now. The violin music grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like a full orchestra. Impossible, but then again, everything about tonight had crossed into the realm of impossible. She pressed her palm against the door, expecting cold stone. Instead, the wood was warm, almost pulsing, like a heartbeat. "Elena, step away from there." Marcus emerged from the tree line, and she got her first clear look at what he'd been carrying, a crossbow, an actual crossbow with what appeared to be silver-tipped bolts. Her ex-boyfriend, the man who'd brought her flowers after difficult shifts, who'd made her laugh for the first time since her mother's death, was armed like he was hunting something inhuman. "Who are you?" she whispered, though the wind snatched the words away. Marcus moved closer, his dark hair plastered to his skull, his familiar brown eyes holding an expression she'd never seen before. Grim determination mixed with something that looked almost like pity. "I'm trying to save you," he called out, "but you have to trust me. Don't go inside that place, Whatever's in there has been waiting for you, Elena. It's been calling to your bloodline for centuries. Bloodline. The word hit her like ice water. In her dreams, that same word appeared over and over. Ancient voices speaking of lineages and birthrights, of queens and dark courts that ruled from shadow. Thunder cracked overhead, so close the stone beneath her feet vibrated. In that brilliant flash of lightning, she saw Marcus clearly, and the symbol carved into his crossbow's stock, a cross wrapped in thorns, surrounded by what looked like protective wards. Vampire hunter. The knowledge hit her with absolute certainty, though she couldn't explain how she knew, just like she couldn't explain the castle or the dreams or why the smell of blood in the ER had started making her mouth water instead of turning her stomach. "What am I?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. Marcus's expression cracked, revealing genuine pain, something that shouldn't exist, something that was supposed to stay buried. The castle doors swung open behind her without a sound, releasing a wave of warmth scented with cedar, old parchment, and something darker, metallic and sweet. The music swelled, and Elena felt an answering chord resonate in her chest, as if her very bones recognized the melody. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and elegant in a way that spoke of centuries rather than years. Even in the storm's chaos, Elena could see his pale eyes, the same eyes from her dreams. Elena. His voice carried a slight accent, Russian perhaps, refined and ancient. "You've come home at last." She stood frozen between past and future, between the hunter who claimed to want to save her and the stranger who felt like destiny. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the ordinary life she'd built, preparing her for whatever truth waited in the castle's golden light. The choice was hers. It always had been. The ordinary world. Elena's hand trembled on the warm castle door as the stranger's words echoed in her mind. "You've come home at last." But this wasn't home. Home was her cramped studio apartment on Southeast Hawthorne, with its leaky faucet and the neighbor's cat that left paw prints on her fire escape. Home was her locker at Providence Medical Center, stuffed with extra scrubs and the thank you cards from patients' families that she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Or it had been, until 3 hours ago when she'd discovered the cameras. The memories slammed into her with fresh horror. She'd been looking for her phone charger behind the nightstand when her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. A tiny device no bigger than a button, tucked into the baseboard. Then another behind the bathroom mirror. One more in the kitchen, positioned perfectly to capture her morning routine. 8 months. Marcus had been watching her for 8 months, documenting her every move like she was a specimen in a lab. The violation burned in her throat, mixing with the betrayal of realizing that their entire relationship had been built on lies. "Elena," the pale-eyed stranger said again, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "You're frightened, but you don't need to be. Not anymore." She turned to look at him fully, this impossible man standing in an impossible castle that had no right to exist in the Cascade Mountains. He was perhaps in his 30s, though something about his stillness suggested far more years than his face revealed. Dark hair, aristocratic features, and those eyes, frost-pale and ancient, exactly like the ones that had been haunting her dreams. Dreams that had started 8 months ago, right around the time she'd met Marcus. "How do you know my name?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would defy logic. The stranger, Dmitri, her mind supplied without explanation, stepped closer to the threshold but didn't cross it, as if he needed permission. "I've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for you." Behind her, Marcus had moved within crossbow range, and she could feel his tension like electricity in the storm-charged air. "Elena, listen to me. Whatever he's telling you, whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's compulsion, mind control." But that wasn't true, was it? Because Elena recognized this feeling, this pull toward the castle and its inhabitant. It was the same longing that had been growing in her for months, subtle at first but increasingly impossible to ignore. The way she'd started craving iron-rich foods until her diet consisted almost entirely of rare steaks and dark leafy greens. The way sunlight had begun to feel harsh against her skin, making her request more night shifts until she was practically nocturnal. The way she'd started looking at the 4 bags in the ER with an inexplicable hunger that terrified her. "Patience," she said suddenly, remembering Mrs. Chen from last Tuesday. The elderly woman had been admitted for severe anemia, her skin paper-thin and translucent. Elena had been drawing blood for labs when the smell hit her, copper and salt and life itself. Her mouth had watered. She'd had to excuse herself to the bathroom where she'd gripped the sink until her knuckles went white, fighting an urge she couldn't name or understand. "What's happening to me?" The words came out as a whisper, lost in the wind. Dimitri's expression softened with something that looked like centuries of patience finally rewarded. "You're remembering who you are, who you've always been." "She's a nurse," Marcus called out, his voice strained. "She saves lives. She's dedicated her career to healing people, Elena. Remember that. Remember who you chose to be." The reminder hit like a physical blow. She had chosen nursing. After her mother's death from cancer when Elena was 22, she'd watched the nurses in oncology work with such gentle competence, providing comfort when medicine failed. She'd wanted to be that for others, a guardian against suffering, a light in people's darkest moments. 7 years she'd spent building that identity. 7 years of double shifts and continuing education courses, of holding hands with dying patients and celebrating with families when loved ones recovered. She was good at her job. More than good, she had instincts that made her colleagues shake their heads in amazement. She could spot a patient crashing before the monitors caught it, could read symptoms like a language written in flesh and blood. Blood. Always, it came back to blood. "The dreams started when you began watching me," Elena said to Marcus, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve clicking into place. "That's not a coincidence." Marcus's face cracked with genuine anguish. "I was trying to protect you. The dreams, the changes, they're accelerating because you're close to this place, to him." Lightning illuminated the 3 of them in stark tableau, the hunter, the hunted, and the ancient being who claimed to have been waiting centuries for this moment. In that flash of white light, Elena saw her reflection in the castle's windows and barely recognized herself. Her dark hair was wild with rain and wind. Her brown eyes held depths that hadn't been there this morning, and her skin had taken on a luminous quality that seemed to glow from within. She looked like someone who belonged in those dreams, someone who could wear a crown and rule from shadow, someone who was no longer entirely human. The moment Elena recognized her transformation, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Not from thunder this time, something deeper, more primal, as if the earth itself was responding to her awakening awareness. The ancient stones of the castle hummed with an energy that resonated in her bones, and she felt a pull so strong it was almost gravitational. "Elena." Dimitri's voice carried a warning now, his pale eyes shifting to scan the forest behind Marcus. "We need to go inside, now." But Marcus raised his crossbow, the silver tip gleaming with more than just reflected lightning. "She's not going anywhere with you." That's when Elena heard them. Howls rising from the depths of the Cascade wilderness. Not wolves, though they shared the same bone-deep hunger. These sounds were wronger, more intelligent, filled with an ancient malevolence that made her newly awakened instincts scream danger. "What is that?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. The dreams had been full of creatures like these, beings that served darker masters and hunted in packs. "Your bloodline isn't the only thing that's been dormant," Dimitri said, his aristocratic composure cracking for the first time. "Your awakening is calling to everything supernatural in these mountains, including things that would very much like to taste the blood of the last Vasquez queen before I can claim you." The last Vasquez queen. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, because suddenly she could see it. Generations of women who had carried this burden, this impossible heritage. Her grandmother, who had died when Elena was 12, whispering strange stories in Spanish about old country legends. Her mother, who had always seemed afraid of something Elena couldn't name, who had moved them across the country when Elena was 16 without explanation, who had died of cancer that no doctor could properly diagnose, her blood work showing anomalies that baffled specialists until the very end. My mother knew, Elena breathed, understanding flooding through her. She was running too. The howls grew closer, accompanied by the sound of massive bodies crashing through underbrush. Marcus spun toward the forest, his crossbow tracking movement between the trees. "There are too many of them," he muttered, and Elena caught something in his voice she'd never heard before: fear. "Elena." Dmitri extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation and a plea. "I can protect you, but only if you choose to trust me." The choice. This was it, the moment that would define not just her future, but her very nature. Behind her, the castle doors stood open, warm light spilling out like golden honey. She could smell old books and cedar, wine and something darker that called to the hunger growing in her chest. Safety, but at what cost? In front of her, Marcus lowered his crossbow slightly, his familiar brown eyes pleading. "Elena, please. I know I lied to you, I know I violated your trust, but I was trying to save you from this. From him, you can still choose to be human. We can fight this together." But even as he spoke, she could see the futility in his expression. Because they both knew the truth now. She had already chosen weeks ago, when she'd started requesting night shifts, months ago when the sight of blood had begun to call to her. Years ago, perhaps, when her mother had whispered those old stories about women who ruled from shadow and commanded the night. A massive shape burst from the tree line, part wolf, part something older and more savage, with eyes that glowed like embers. Marcus fired without hesitation, his silver bolt finding its mark, and the creature dissolved into mist with a shriek that made Elena's ears ring. But there were more, so many more. "Choose," Dmitri said urgently, his hand still extended. "Choose now, before it's too late for all of us." Elena looked down at her hands, her nurse's hands that had saved countless lives, that had provided comfort in humanity's darkest moments. They were still steady, still capable of healing. But now she could see the veins beneath her pale skin more clearly, could feel the alien pulse of power flowing through them. She thought of Mrs. Chen, of how the old woman's blood had smelled like salvation and sin. She thought of her mother's mysterious death, of her grandmother's whispered warnings. She thought of 7 years building a life that had always felt like she was wearing someone else's clothes. And she thought of the dreams, not nightmares, she realized now, but memories. A queen who had ruled justly, who had protected both human and vampire alike, who had been loved, not feared. The howls were everywhere now, circling, closing in. Marcus fired again and again, but Elena could see the hopelessness in his movements. They were outnumbered, outmatched, unless she became something that could match them. Elena took a step toward Dmitri's outstretched hand, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a crown. But as Elena reached toward Dmitri's hand, her fingers trembling inches from his pale skin, she froze. The weight of what she was about to surrender crashed over her like a physical blow, and she pulled back as if his touch might burn her. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I can't just stop being human." The howls grew closer, more urgent, but Elena barely heard them over the thundering of her own heart, a heart that still beat with human rhythm, human need. She thought of her patience, of the oath she'd taken to first do no harm. How could she honor that promise if she became something that craved the very essence of life she'd sworn to protect? "Elena!" Dmitri's voice carried centuries of patience, but underneath she heard something desperate. "You were never meant to be merely human. Fighting your nature will only bring you pain." "My nature?" she laughed, but the sound came out broken. "My nature is to save lives, not take them. I became a nurse because I wanted to heal people, not—" She gestured helplessly at the glowing hunger she could feel pulsing beneath her skin. "Not whatever this is." Marcus fired another bolt into the darkness, silver light arcing through the rain. "She's right to hesitate," he called out, his voice strained. "Once you cross that threshold, Elena, there's no going back. You'll lose everything that makes you who you are." But was that true? Even as Elena stood paralyzed between her two worlds, she could feel the power thrumming in her veins, alien yet familiar. In her dreams, memories, she corrected herself, the vampire queen had been more than a monster. She had been a protector, a bridge between worlds, someone who understood that true strength came from choosing mercy when violence would be easier. Still, the cost felt impossibly high. "My patients need me," Elena said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Mrs. Patterson is scheduled for surgery next week, and there's a new nursing student I'm supposed to mentor, and—" "Your old life is already over," Dmitri interrupted gently. "The moment you discovered Marcus's surveillance, the moment you ran into these woods, you left that world behind. The only question now is whether you'll step into your true inheritance or let yourself be torn apart by forces you can't comprehend." A massive creature burst through the trees not 20 feet away, its eyes fixed on Elena with predatory intelligence. Marcus's bolt caught it in the shoulder, but it barely slowed down. The thing's maw opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and Elena could smell its hunger. Rank and wild and absolutely fixated on her. She stumbled backward toward the castle doors, but even as her body sought safety, her mind rebelled. What if Dmitri was lying? What if this was all some elaborate manipulation, a way to trap her in a prison of her own making? The rational part of her, the part trained to question symptoms, to verify before acting, screamed warnings. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "How do I know any of this is real?" Dmitri's pale eyes softened with something that looked like genuine sorrow. "Because you can feel it, Elena. Every time you've looked at blood, every time you've craved the night, every time you've felt like your life in Portland was just a costume you were wearing, you've felt the truth calling to you." The creature lunged, and Marcus dove sideways, rolling through the mud as claws raked the air where he'd been standing. Two more shapes emerged from the forest, their attention split between the hunter and the woman they'd been sent to claim. Elena's hands pressed against her temples as the weight of decision threatened to crush her. 7 years of building a life, of finding purpose in healing, of slowly constructing an identity from the ashes of her mother's death. Could she really throw all of that away for a heritage she didn't understand, for memories that might not even be hers? But then she thought of Mrs. Chen again, of how the elderly woman's blood had called to her, of how Elena had known, with absolute certainty, that she could help in ways that went beyond medicine, if only she had the courage to embrace what she was becoming. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely a whisper. "I know," Dmitri replied, his hand still extended, patient as stone. "Fear is wisdom in this moment. But so is trust." Another howl split the night, closer now, and Elena could see glowing eyes surrounding them in the darkness. Marcus had managed to down one of the creatures, but his crossbow only held so many bolts, and they were multiplying like shadows given flesh. Time was running out, for all of them. Elena looked at her hands one more time, steady, capable, marked by years of service to humanity. Whatever choice she made, she couldn't let those years be meaningless. She had to choose who she would save. Elena's hand moved before her mind fully understood the decision, fingers interlacing with Dmitri's cool palm. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Power rushed through her like lightning made liquid, ancient and vast and utterly foreign. Her knees buckled, but Dmitri's grip held her steady as memories that weren't quite her own flooded her consciousness. She saw herself, saw her ancestor, standing on castle battlements overlooking valleys shrouded in mist, felt the weight of a crown that commanded both respect and fear, tasted the copper-sweet sustenance that had sustained her bloodline for centuries. "Elena!" Marcus's shout cut through the visions, but it sounded distant now, as if he were calling to her from across an ocean rather than 20 feet away. The creatures pressed closer, drawn by the surge of supernatural energy. She could smell their hunger, rank and desperate, but underneath it she sensed something else. Fear. They were afraid of what she was becoming. "Inside," Dmitri commanded, pulling her toward the castle doors. "The threshold will protect you while the change completes." But Elena planted her feet, even as power continued to course through her transformed veins. Through the chaos of sensation, one image remained crystal clear: Mrs. Chen's grateful smile when Elena had managed to find a vein on the third try, had made the blood draw quick and painless. The elderly woman's whispered "Gracias, mija," in accented English. "I won't abandon him," Elena said, her voice strange to her own ears, deeper, carrying an authority she'd never possessed. She looked at Marcus, who was backing toward the castle while firing bolt after silver bolt into the advancing pack. "He may have lied to me, but he's still human, still trying to save people." Dmitri's pale eyes flashed with something between admiration and exasperation. "Your compassion will get us all killed." "My compassion is who I am," Elena replied, and for the first time since touching his hand, she felt certain of something. The power thrumming through her didn't have to erase her humanity, it could amplify it. If becoming a vampire means losing that, then what's the point of survival? A massive creature broke through Marcus's defensive line, its claws raking across his shoulder and spinning him into the mud. His crossbow flew from his hands, sliding uselessly across the rain-soaked ground. The beast loomed over him, slavering jaws opening wide. Elena moved without thinking, the ancient power in her blood responding to her will in ways she didn't understand, but didn't question. She was across the space between them in a heartbeat, faster than thought, faster than the creature's reflexes. Her hand, no longer entirely human, caught the beast by its throat and lifted it bodily into the air. The creature writhed in her grip, but Elena held it effortlessly. Through its struggles she felt something else, the pull that had driven it here, the supernatural compulsion that had dragged it from whatever dark corner of the mountains it normally inhabited. "You're not the real threat," she realized, looking into its glowing eyes. "Someone sent you." The beast's form flickered, becoming translucent for a moment, and Elena caught a glimpse of the magic binding it, ancient, malevolent, and definitely not random. She released the creature, but instead of attacking, it stumbled backward, suddenly unsure. The other pack members hesitated too, their predatory formation wavering. Elena could feel the change in the air, the way her presence was disrupting whatever spell had driven them to hunt her. "They're not here to kill me," she said, understanding flooding through her. "They're here to force my hand, to make me choose between becoming a monster or dying human." Marcus struggled to his feet, blood streaming from the gashes on his shoulder. "Elena, what are you—" "Someone wants me to embrace the darkness," she continued, her enhanced senses picking up traces of magic like a scent trail. "But that's not the only choice, is it?" She turned to Dmitri, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "The vampire queen in my memories. She wasn't a monster. She was a bridge between worlds. She found a way to be what she was without losing who she chose to be." "That path is not easy," Dmitri warned, though something in his voice suggested hope. "It requires sacrifice, constant vigilance. The hunger never truly goes away." "I'm a trauma nurse," Elena said, feeling her old identity and her new nature beginning to weave together instead of war against each other. "I'm used to difficult choices and constant vigilance." The creatures began to retreat, their supernatural compulsion broken by her refusal to become the monster their summoner had expected. Elena watched them melt back into the forest, then turned to help Marcus to his feet. "This isn't over," she told him, her enhanced hearing picking up the distant sound of vehicles approaching through the storm. "Whoever's behind this, whatever they want with my bloodline, they're not going to stop just because I chose a different path." Marcus met her eyes, seeing the changes there, but also recognizing something familiar. "You're still you." "I'm still me," Elena agreed, then looked at Dmitri. "But I'm also something more, and I'm going to learn how to be both." She stepped across the castle threshold, pulling Marcus with her, leaving her old life behind, but carrying its lessons forward into whatever came next. The heavy oak doors of Dimitri's castle closed behind them with a resonance that seemed to echo through Elena's bones. The sudden silence felt almost oppressive after the chaos of the storm and the supernatural hunt outside. Elena's enhanced senses immediately catalogued everything: the scent of aged stone and burning candles, the whisper of silk tapestries stirring in draughts she couldn't feel, and underneath it all, something that made her newly awakened hunger stir restlessly. "Welcome to Corvain Castle," Dimitri said, his aristocratic composure returning now that they were within his domain. "Your ancestral home, in a manner of speaking." Elena helped Marcus lean against the stone wall of the entry hall while she took in her surroundings. The interior was every bit as impossible as the exterior, medieval architecture that should have crumbled centuries ago, lit by torches that burned without smoke and tapestries that depicted scenes from a history she was only beginning to understand. "This place shouldn't exist," Marcus muttered, pressing his hand against his shoulder wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, and Elena had to force herself to focus on his injury rather than the way the scent made her mouth water. "Many things shouldn't exist," came a new voice from the shadows of a grand staircase. "Yet here we all are." A woman emerged from the darkness, tall, elegant, with silver hair that caught the torchlight like spun metal. Her eyes were the same pale blue as Dimitri's, but where his held warmth, hers were calculating. She moved with the predatory grace Elena was beginning to recognize in her own transformed state. "Elena," Dimitri said carefully, "this is Irina Corvain, my sister." "Half-sister," Irina corrected, her gaze fixed on Elena with uncomfortable intensity. "And I must say, brother, your chosen queen is not what I expected." The words stung, though Elena couldn't say why. "I haven't chosen anything yet," she replied, lifting her chin. "I'm still learning the rules of this world you've pulled me into." Irina's laugh was like silver bells with razor edges. "Rules? Oh, my dear, there is only one rule that matters in our world: survive or become food for those stronger than you. Everything else is sentiment." "Irina." Dimitri's warning carried the weight of centuries. "No, let her speak," Elena said, stepping away from Marcus despite his grunt of protest. The power in her blood was steadying now, settling into her bones like it belonged there. "I need to understand what I'm dealing with, all of it." Irina smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. How refreshingly direct. "Very well. Your bloodline carries the potential to unite the vampire courts that have been at war for 300 years. Dimitri believes you can usher in some golden age of peace and cooperation." She paused, circling Elena like a predator evaluating prey. "I believe you're more likely to get us all killed." "Why?" Elena asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because peace requires strength, little queen, and strength requires sacrifice. It requires making choices that preserve the greater good, even when they feel monstrous. Your display outside, sparing those creatures, insisting on protecting a vampire hunter, that's not strength. That's weakness that will be exploited by every enemy we have." Marcus struggled to straighten, his crossbow somehow back in his hands despite his injury. "She's not weak. She's choosing to be better than what you are." Irina's eyes flicked to him with predatory interest. A hunter defending his quarry? How unprecedented. She looked back at Elena. "Tell me, future queen, when this human becomes a liability, when his presence endangers innocent lives, will your compassion still guide you, or will you make the hard choice?" Before Elena could answer, the castle shuddered around them. Dust rained from ancient stones, and the torches flickered in unison. Through the thick walls, Elena could hear engines, multiple vehicles approaching fast. "They followed us," Marcus said grimly. "Of course they did," Irina replied, but she didn't sound surprised. If anything, she seemed pleased. "Did you think that little display of mercy would end things? You've announced your awakening to every supernatural power in the Pacific Northwest. They're all coming to test you now. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Test me how? Dmitri moved to a narrow window, peering out through thick glass. Cars, armed men, and his expression darkened. Something else, something old. The castle shuddered again, more violently this time, and Elena heard Marcus curse under his breath. When she turned to him, his face had gone pale. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about the people who hired me, about why they really want your bloodline." But before he could continue, the main doors exploded inward in a shower of splinters and ancient iron. Through the breach came figures in tactical gear, weapons trained on the group, but Elena's enhanced vision caught something else, symbols carved into their armor that made her ancestral memories scream warnings. "Inquisitors," Dmitri breathed. Elena felt the weight of destiny settling heavier on her shoulders as she realized the tests were just beginning. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Inquisitors. Elena's ancestral memories flooded her consciousness unbidden, images of stake-filled courtyards, of her bloodline hunted to near extinction, of ancient vampires reduced to ash while screaming prayers that would never be answered. "Everyone down!" Marcus shouted. But the lead inquisitor raised his hand, and an unnatural silence fell over the great hall. Elena could see his lips moving, recognizing the cadence of Latin, even if she couldn't make out the words through the supernatural quiet. "A binding spell," Irina said conversationally, though her body had gone perfectly still. How quaint. They still think the old ways work on our kind. But Elena could feel the magic pressing against her consciousness like a weighted blanket, and she realized with growing horror that the spell was affecting her differently than the others. Where Dmitri and Irina seemed merely annoyed, Elena felt her newly awakened power being systematically suppressed, forced back into the locked corners of her mind. "They know," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "They know exactly what I am." The lead inquisitor stepped through the ruined doorway, removing his helmet to reveal a face that could have belonged to a college professor, middle-aged, unremarkable, except for eyes that held the absolute certainty of a fanatic. Behind him, 6 more figures spread out in a practiced formation, their weapons trained not on Dmitri or Irina, but specifically on Elena. "Elena Vasquez," the man said, his voice carrying easily through the supernatural silence. "Descendant of the Midnight Court, last heir to the Sanguis Rex bloodline." He smiled, and Elena felt ice form in her stomach. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Marcus stepped forward, his crossbow raised despite his wounded shoulder. "She's under my protection." The Inquisitor's laugh was genuinely amused. "Marcus Reed, the hunter who couldn't kill. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused us? We've been feeding you information for months, guiding you toward your target, and instead of eliminating the threat as contracted, you chose to play protector." Elena's enhanced hearing caught the subtle intake of breath from her companions, but it was Dmitri who voiced what they were all thinking. "You've been manipulating both sides," he said, his aristocratic composure cracking slightly. "The vampire courts, the hunters, even the creatures in the forest. All of it orchestrated. The church militant has had centuries to learn patience," the Inquisitor replied. "We knew the Sanguis Rex bloodline would eventually resurface. We simply ensured we would be ready when it did." His gaze fixed on Elena with scientific interest. "Tell me, Miss Vasquez, how does it feel to know that every choice you've made, leaving Portland, fleeing into these mountains, even awakening your heritage, has been guided by our design?" Elena felt rage building in her chest, hot and bright and absolutely murderous. The binding spell pressed harder against her consciousness, but underneath it, she could feel her power responding to her emotion, growing stronger rather than weaker. "You're wrong," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made the ancient stones of the castle ring in sympathy. "I chose to save Marcus. I chose mercy over violence. Those weren't your decisions, they were mine." "Mercy," the Inquisitor repeated, as if the word tasted foul. "The fatal flaw of your bloodline. Your ancestor could have ruled the world, but she chose coexistence, cooperation. She taught her children to see humans as partners rather than prey. His expression hardened. That weakness ends tonight. Irina moved so quickly she was barely a blur, but the Inquisitor was ready. His hand closed around an amulet at his throat, and silver light blazed through the hall. Irina screamed, her form becoming translucent as the holy energy tore through her supernatural flesh. "Irina!" Dmitri surged forward, but two more Inquisitors stepped into his path, their weapons crackling with the same silver fire. Elena felt the binding spell tighten around her mind like a vice. But something was different now. The rage, the desperation, the absolute refusal to watch people she cared about suffer. It was changing the nature of her power, making it something the ancient binding couldn't quite contain. The old magics were designed for the old bloodlines, she realized, her voice growing stronger with each word. But I'm not just vampire royalty. I'm also a trauma nurse who spent 7 years learning to save lives under pressure. I'm someone who chose to evolve instead of just survive. Marcus raised his crossbow, but Elena could see that his wounded shoulder was affecting his aim. The Inquisitors were closing in, their weapons raised, and she realized that everything, Dimitri's centuries of waiting, Irina's cynical strength, Marcus's hard-won redemption, was about to end because she couldn't break free of a spell designed for a version of herself that no longer existed. "Choose," Elena Vasquez, the lead Inquisitor commanded, his voice resonating with supernatural compulsion. "Submit to purification, or watch everyone you've started to care about burn." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible decisions, and began to understand what her ancestor had truly faced all those centuries ago. Elena opened her eyes, and the world had changed. Not visually. The Inquisitors still stood in their tactical formation. Their weapons still crackled with silver fire. Irina still writhed in translucent agony against the far wall. But Elena could feel the difference, a fundamental shift in the fabric of reality around her, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. "I understand now," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that made the ancient stones sing. "You didn't orchestrate everything. You just took credit for the choices people were always going to make." The binding spell pressed against her consciousness like a crushing weight, but Elena didn't fight it anymore. Instead, she let it flow through her, around her, recognizing it for what it truly was, a lock designed for a door that no longer existed. "The old bloodlines were pure vampire," she continued, taking a step forward despite the lead Inquisitor's startled expression. "But I'm something you didn't plan for, something that's never existed before." Her power wasn't being suppressed by the binding spell, it was being refined by it. Every attempt to lock away her vampiric nature only highlighted what remained, her human compassion, her medical training, her fundamental need to heal rather than harm. And somehow, impossibly, those human traits were amplifying her supernatural abilities rather than diminishing them. "Elena, don't—" Marcus started, but she was already moving. Not with vampire speed, not with predatory grace, but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years moving through hospital corridors during crises. She reached Irina first, placing her hands on the translucent form, and felt the silver fire burning through the vampire's essence. In the ER, Elena had learned to work while adrenaline flooded her system. She'd learned to stay calm while patients screamed, to think clearly while blood soaked her scrubs, to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Now she applied that same clinical detachment to the supernatural energy tearing Irina apart. "Holy fire burns spiritual corruption," she murmured, her hands moving over Irina's form like she was assessing trauma. "But you're not corrupted. You're just different. And difference isn't something you cure, it's something you integrate." Elena felt the silver fire recognize her touch, and for a moment she understood the terrible irony of what was happening. The Inquisitor's magic washily. It was designed to heal, to purify, to restore. But they'd weaponized it, turned sanctification into destruction. They were using the power of life to cause death. "That's not what this energy wants to do," she said, loud enough for the lead inquisitor to hear. "You've twisted it, perverted it, made it into the opposite of what it was meant to be." She pressed her palms flat against Irina's chest and pushed, not with force, but with intention. The silver fire responded to her touch, flowing away from destruction and back toward its original purpose. Instead of burning away Irina's vampiric nature, it began to burn away the corruption of that nature, the bitterness, the cynicism, the assumption that predator and prey were the only possible roles. Irina gasped, her form solidifying as the fire completed its true work. When she looked at Elena, her pale eyes held something they hadn't before, wonder. "How?" she whispered. "Because I never stopped being a healer," Elena replied, then turned toward the inquisitors. "And because they forgot what holy actually means." The lead inquisitor's face had gone white. "Impossible. You're an abomination." The old texts were written by people who thought integration was impossible, Elena interrupted, walking toward him with steady steps. The binding spell was still active, still pressing against her consciousness, but it felt less like a restraint now and more like a reminder of who she chose to be. They assumed that supernatural power automatically corrupted human nature. They never considered that human nature might transform supernatural power instead. She could feel the change spreading through the castle, through the very air around them. Her presence was somehow sanctifying the space, not destroying its supernatural aspects, but healing them, the way she'd healed Irina. The ancient stones seemed to sigh with relief, as if they'd been carrying a burden for centuries and could finally set it down. "You can't," the Inquisitor said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "The prophecies state clearly that the Sanguis Rex bloodline will either dominate humanity or be destroyed by it. There is no third option." Elena smiled and felt her fangs extend, not in predatory threat, but in simple acknowledgement of what she was. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "Do you know what we do when someone tells us there are no options left?" Marcus lowered his crossbow, understanding dawning in his eyes. Dmitri stepped forward, his aristocratic mask finally slipping to reveal something like hope. "We find a third option," Elena continued, reaching toward the lead inquisitor, not with supernatural speed or vampiric compulsion, but with the same calm confidence she'd used to approach countless frightened patients. "We always find a third option." The silver fire in the Inquisitor's weapons began to flicker, responding to her presence the same way it had responded to her touch with Irina. And Elena realized that the real ordeal wasn't surviving their attack, it was choosing to heal her enemies instead of destroying them. The lead Inquisitor's hand tightened around his amulet as Elena approached, and the silver fire blazed brighter, but instead of weakening, Elena felt her power surge in response. For one impossible moment, she thought she had won, that her revelation about the true nature of holy energy would be enough to turn enemies into allies, to transform this confrontation into the healing she desperately wanted to achieve. Then the Inquisitor smiled, and Elena's world shattered. "Did you really think," he said softly, "that we hadn't prepared for this possibility? That 7 centuries of hunting your bloodline taught us nothing about the seductive power of your mercy?" The silver fire in his amulet shifted, deepened, and Elena felt something she had never experienced before. Holy energy that remained pure in its intention, but was guided by a will that had deliberately chosen damnation. Not corrupted power, but sanctified hatred. "You're not healing us, child," the Inquisitor continued, his voice gentle with the patience of absolute conviction. "You're proving exactly why your bloodline must be extinguished. Your very existence is a perversion of the natural order." Elena reached for him anyway, driven by desperate hope, but the moment her fingers touched the blazing amulet, agony beyond description tore through her consciousness. Not just pain, understanding. She saw what he had seen, felt what he had felt, experienced the centuries of dedicated study that had led him to this moment. The Inquisitors hadn't just been hunting vampires, They had been hunting the possibility of integration itself, every supernatural being who had tried to find balance between their nature and their humanity. Every vampire who had chosen mercy over predation, every werewolf who had protected instead of killed, all of them had been systematically eliminated to preserve the purity of the conflict between good and evil. "You see it now," the Inquisitor whispered, as Elena fell to her knees, the holy fire burning through her attempts at synthesis. "There can be no middle ground, no third option. You heal us, you doom humanity to eventual subjugation by beings who will pretend to mercy while slowly claiming dominion. You maintain the conflict, and at least some humans survive." Through her agony, Elena heard Marcus roar with rage, heard the distinctive thunk of crossbow bolts finding their targets. But the Inquisitors had come prepared for a hunter's skills as well, and she heard him cry out in pain as return fire found its mark. "Marcus!" She tried to turn toward him, but the holy fire was spreading through her nervous system now, burning away not her vampiric nature, but her ability to reconcile it with her humanity. The synthesis she had achieved was being systematically undone, and she could feel herself fracturing back into incompatible pieces. Dmitri was fighting now too, his aristocratic restraint abandoned in favor of pure vampiric fury. She heard ancient stone crack under supernatural strength, heard the whistle of displaced air as he moved faster than human eyes could follow. But there were too many Inquisitors, and their weapons had been specifically designed to counter even elder vampire abilities. "Stop," Elena tried to say, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, stop." "This is what mercy costs," Irina said, and Elena realized the vampire was kneeling beside her, speaking directly into her ear. "This is what I tried to warn you about. Your compassion is being used as a weapon against everyone you care about." Elena tried to focus on Irina's face, but her vision was fracturing along with everything else. "I can still—" "No," Irina said gently, and for the first time her voice held no cruelty. "You can't. They've made sure of that. The only choice left is which version of yourself survives this, the vampire who could burn them all to ash, or the human who will let them kill everyone you're trying to protect." Through the chaos of battle around them, Elena heard the lead Inquisitor speaking in Latin again, felt a new binding spell taking hold, not of her power this time, but of her choice itself. She was being forced into the exact binary she had thought to transcend, become a monster, or watch everything she cared about die. "Choose quickly," the Inquisitor called over the sound of continuing violence. "Your lover is bleeding out, your king is overwhelmed, and even your cynical sister-in-law can't hold them off much longer. Become the weapon your bloodline was meant to be, or let this be the end of all of them." Elena felt Marcus's blood spreading across the ancient stones, felt Dimitri's strength beginning to fail against superior numbers, felt Irina's protective stance over her wavering as more Inquisitors poured through the shattered doors. The castle that had seemed like sanctuary was becoming a tomb, and her attempt to find a third option had only ensured that everyone she had started to love would die for her naive idealism. The holy fire burned brighter, demanding her choice, and Elena realized that sometimes there truly were no good options left, only degrees of damnation, and the terrible responsibility of choosing which one you could live with. Elena knelt there in the burning circle of holy fire, feeling the Inquisitor's ultimatum pressing down on her like a physical weight, and suddenly began to laugh. The sound was soft at first, barely audible over the clash of supernatural combat, but it carried something that made everyone in the Great Hall pause, even the Inquisitors faltering in their systematic advance, because Elena's laughter held no hysteria, no desperation, no hint of the madness they expected from someone facing an impossible choice. Instead, it carried the weary amusement of a trauma nurse who had just realized that everyone in the room was missing something obvious. 7 years in Portland General's emergency department, she said, still chuckling as she pushed herself to her feet, despite the holy fire burning through her nervous system. "Do you know how many times someone's told me there were only 2 choices? Save the mother or save the baby, save the limb or save the life. Treat the overdose patient or treat the assault victim when you only have resources for one. The lead inquisitor's confident expression flickered. Your medical training is irrelevant here. This is a matter of triage, Elena interrupted, and suddenly her voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with vampiric compulsion and everything to do with 7 years of making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, which you clearly don't understand. She looked around the hall, taking in the tactical situation with the same clinical assessment she'd once used for mass casualty events. Marcus was down but breathing, his crossbow bolt wounds serious but not immediately fatal. Dmitri was overwhelmed but holding his position, using his supernatural speed to prevent the Inquisitors from establishing a killing formation. Irina was weakened but still mobile, her earlier healing having restored enough of her strength to maintain defensive posture. The thing about impossible choices, Elena continued, the holy fire still burning through her but no longer fracturing her consciousness, is that they're usually based on false assumptions. You're telling me I have to choose between being a monster who kills you all or being human and watching you kill everyone I care about. She took a step forward, and the ancient stones of the castle floor responded to her presence, not with the supernatural resonance of vampiric power, but with something deeper, something that recognized her not as predator or prey, but as exactly what she was, a healer who had finally understood the true nature of her patient. "But you're not my enemy," she said, and her words carried absolute conviction. "You're my patient. You've been sick for 7 centuries with the same disease that's infected every supernatural conflict in history, the inability to conceive of coexistence as anything other than weakness." The binding spell pressed harder against her consciousness, trying to force her back into the binary choice. But Elena had spent too many years working while exhausted, while pressured, while facing situations that demanded perfect focus, despite imperfect circumstances. She let the spell flow around her, like she'd once let the chaos of the ER flow around her, acknowledging it without being controlled by it. The Sanguis Rex bloodline wasn't meant to rule, she realized, the understanding hitting her with the force of revelation. It was meant to heal, to synthesize, to serve as a bridge between human and supernatural, the same way trauma surgeons serve as bridges between life and death. The lead inquisitor raised his weapon, but Elena was already moving, not with supernatural speed, not with predatory intent, but with the purposeful stride of someone responding to a code blue. She reached him before he could fire, her hands closing not around his throat, but around the blazing amulet at his chest. The holy fire roared through her, but Elena had touched infected wounds, had worked with her hands inside bodies ravaged by disease, had learned to accept contamination as part of the healing process. Instead of fighting the sacred energy, she absorbed it, let it burn through every shadow of doubt or selfishness or predatory instinct that remained in her supernatural nature. But the fire didn't stop there. It flowed through her and into the Inquisitor, and Elena felt his centuries of righteous hatred like a massive infection that had been poisoning his soul. The same fire that had been burning away her darkness began burning away his, not his faith, not his dedication to protecting humanity, but the corruption of those noble impulses into something that could only see destruction as victory. "This is what mercy actually looks like," Elena said, as the silver light blazed between them. Not weakness, not compromise. Healing the disease so completely that everyone walks away stronger than they were before. Around the hall, she felt the change spreading like antibiotics through a system-wide infection. The other inquisitors lowered their weapons, confusion replacing certainty in their eyes. Dmitri stopped his desperate defense, staring at Elena with something like awe. Marcus struggled to his feet, supported by Irina, whose cynical expression had been replaced by wonder. But Elena's attention remained focused on the man in her grip, feeling 7 centuries of poison burning away in holy fire, watching hatred transform into understanding in his eyes. "Now," she said quietly, "let's find that third option." The silver light faded slowly, leaving the great hall in an almost reverent silence. Elena kept her hands on the Inquisitor's amulet for another moment, feeling the last echoes of transformation ripple through both their souls before finally stepping back. The man who had been prepared to destroy her moments before now looked at her with eyes that held wonder instead of hatred. "I understand now," he said softly, his voice hoarse from the spiritual purging. "The texts. We interpreted them as warnings about domination, but they were instructions for integration, 7 centuries of preparation for the wrong war." Elena nodded, then swayed slightly as the full impact of what she'd just accomplished hit her. Channeling that much holy energy while maintaining her vampiric nature should have been impossible, would have been impossible if she hadn't finally understood that the contradiction itself was the point. She was meant to be both things simultaneously, a living bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to coexist. Dmitri was beside her instantly, his arm sliding around her waist to steady her. "Elena, are you—" "I'm tired," she admitted, leaning into his support gratefully. "But I'm also more myself than I've ever been. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Marcus said, limping toward them with Irina's assistance. His crossbow bolt wounds were still bleeding, but his hunter's instincts had clearly recognized the shift in the room's dynamics. The weapons trained on them moments before were now lowered, their wielders looking more lost than threatening. Question is, what happens now? They came here to eliminate a threat to humanity. That threat still exists, technically. The lead inquisitor, who had yet to give them his name, overheard the exchange. "The threat was never your existence," he said, addressing Elena directly. "It was the assumption that your bloodline would eventually choose domination over service. But you've proven that assumption false." He looked around at his fellow inquisitors, many of whom were still processing their own sudden clarity. "We have much to discuss among ourselves, centuries of doctrine to re-examine. But I believe we may have found our true purpose at last." "Which is?" Irina asked, her cynicism still present, but tempered now by curiosity rather than bitterness. "What it should have been from the beginning," the Inquisitor replied. "Working with beings like Elena, not against them. Helping to establish the kind of coexistence we spent so long believing was impossible." Elena felt a surge of hope, but also practical concern. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the larger implications were staggering. "There are others," she said. "Other vampires who've been hiding, other supernatural beings who've been fighting this same battle between their nature and their humanity. And there are more hunters, too. Marcus isn't the only one who's been hired to eliminate threats." "Then we have work to do," Dmitri said simply. "All of us." The next hour passed in careful negotiation, with Elena finding herself cast in the unexpected role of mediator. Her trauma nursing experience proved invaluable. She was used to coordinating between different specialists, to making sure everyone's expertise contributed to the patient's recovery rather than competing for dominance. Marcus provided tactical intelligence about the broader hunter network, while Irina offered insights into vampire politics that had been invisible to human observers. The Inquisitors contributed centuries of research into supernatural abilities and weaknesses, but now with the goal of understanding rather than exploitation. And Dmitri, with his elder vampire perspective, helped everyone understand the historical patterns that had led to the current crisis. "There's a gathering," Marcus revealed, "in 3 weeks. Major players in the supernatural hunting community, comparing notes and coordinating efforts. If Elena's willing to attend, under heavy protection, obviously, we might be able to convert some of the more reasonable voices. And there's a vampire conclave scheduled for the winter solstice," Dmitri added. "First one in 50 years, if we can demonstrate that integration is possible rather than just theoretical." Elena listened to the planning take shape around her, feeling the same satisfaction she'd once experienced when a trauma team finally clicked into perfect coordination, everyone bringing their expertise to bear on a common goal, their former antagonism transformed into collaborative energy. But she also felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were essentially trying to rewrite the rules of supernatural existence, to establish new patterns of interaction that had no historical precedent. The margin for error was non-existent. A single failure could undo everything they'd achieved tonight and convince both sides that the old ways of eternal conflict were safer. "We'll need to start small," she said, when the immediate tactical discussion wound down. "Prove the concept works before we try to scale it up. And we'll need safeguards, ways to intervene if someone starts sliding back toward the old patterns." The lead inquisitor, who had finally introduced himself as Father Gabriel Santos, nodded thoughtfully. "A pilot program. Carefully controlled conditions, extensive monitoring, clear protocols for both success and failure." Elena smiled, recognizing the language of medical trials. "Exactly. We're not just changing politics. We're changing nature itself. That requires the same kind of careful methodology we'd use for any experimental treatment." As dawn approached and their unlikely alliance began to take concrete shape, Elena realized that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time since she'd fled into the forest, she felt genuinely hopeful about what they might accomplish together. The euphoria of potential victory faded as the first pale light of dawn crept through the castle's ancient windows, replaced by the sobering reality of what they had committed themselves to attempting. Elena watched the mixed group of vampires, hunters, and inquisitors continuing their planning and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders. The same feeling she'd experienced as a new trauma nurse, realizing that lives now depended on decisions she wasn't entirely sure she was qualified to make. "Second thoughts?" Dmitri asked quietly, appearing beside her with the silent grace she was still getting used to. His formal composure had returned with the daylight, but she could see the concern in his dark eyes. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. "In the ER, when we tried experimental treatments, we had institutional review boards, ethics committees, legal oversight. Here," she gestured at their unlikely assembly, "we're essentially conducting the most dangerous medical trial in supernatural history, with no oversight except our own judgment." Marcus approached them, moving more carefully now that adrenaline was no longer masking his injuries. "Speaking of oversight, we need to discuss timeline. The hunter-gathering I mentioned isn't just a social event, it's where contracts get distributed for the next season. If we wait too long to make our move, there'll be kill orders circulating that we can't recall." The practical implications hit Elena like a physical blow. While they'd been focusing on the philosophical breakthrough of achieving synthesis, the machinery of supernatural warfare was continuing to operate. Somewhere, other beings like her were being hunted by people like Marcus, and other hunters were being hired by clients who saw negotiation as weakness. "How many?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Active contracts? Maybe 24 across North America. Potential targets identified for future elimination." Marcus's expression darkened. "Hundreds." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Each number represented someone facing the same impossible choice she'd been offered: become a monster or die as a victim. "We're not just trying to save ourselves, we're trying to prevent a genocide." "Which is why failure isn't an option," Irina said, joining their cluster. The vampire's cynicism had been replaced by something grimmer, the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly what they were up against. "If our little experiment collapses, it won't just prove that coexistence is impossible. It'll provide justification for accelerating the extermination campaigns." Father Santos approached them, his transformed perspective evident in the way he moved, still purposeful, but no longer carrying the rigid certainty of divine mandate. "We've been discussing the same concern," he said. "My order has cells throughout the Americas and Europe. If this fails, the backlash will be swift and absolute. Every supernatural being who's been living peacefully in human society will become a priority target." The weight of potential consequences pressed down on Elena's shoulders until she felt she might buckle under it. In the ER, failed treatments meant individual tragedies. Here, failure meant species-level catastrophe. "Then we don't fail," Dmitri said with quiet authority. "Elena, you've shown us that synthesis is possible. Now we prove it's sustainable." But even as he spoke, Elena could feel the fragility of what they'd achieved. The holy fire had burned away the immediate hatred and fear, but those emotions had deep roots in centuries of conditioning. Would Father Santos still feel the same clarity about cooperation when he faced a vampire in bloodlust? Would the other inquisitors maintain their new perspective when confronted with actual supernatural predation? And what about her own synthesis? The integration of her human and vampiric natures felt stable now, but she'd achieved it under extreme duress, in a moment of life-or-death crisis. Could she maintain that balance during normal existence? What happened if her vampiric hunger grew stronger, or if her human compassion became a liability? "We need contingencies," she said suddenly. "Not just plans for success, but protocols for if I start losing control of my nature, if any of us do." The assembled group fell silent, and Elena realized she'd voiced the fear none of them wanted to acknowledge. They were betting the future of supernatural coexistence on the stability of transformations achieved in a moment of mystical crisis. But mystical experiences, however profound, didn't always translate into permanent change. Marcus was the first to speak. "Kill switches," he said bluntly. "Ways to contain the damage if someone reverts to old patterns. I keep my hunter's arsenal. The Inquisitors maintain their binding capabilities. Dmitri and Irina keep their vampire strength in reserve." "And if it's Elena who becomes unstable?" Irina asked with brutal directness. "If the synthesis breaks down and she becomes what the prophecies always suggested, a weapon capable of enslaving both sides?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt every eye in the room focus on her and realized that this was the moment when her commitment would be truly tested. Not in the heat of battle, not in a moment of transcendent revelation, but in the cold light of dawn when consequences became real. "Then you stop me," she said quietly. "Whatever it takes." The silence that followed Elena's words stretched like a held breath, heavy with the weight of promises no one wanted to make, but everyone understood were necessary. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with making life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure. But this time, the stakes weren't measured in individual lives. They were measured in the survival of entire species. "Good," Father Santos said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent centuries making hard choices. "Now that we've acknowledged the worst-case scenarios, we can prepare for them properly." But Elena could see the doubt creeping back into the eyes around her. The mystical clarity of the holy fire was beginning to fade, replaced by the practical fears that had driven supernatural conflicts for millennia. She recognized the signs from countless trauma cases where initial hope had given way to the grinding reality of long-term recovery. "There's something else," she said, forcing herself to voice the concern that had been growing in her mind. "We're assuming that what happened to me, the synthesis, can be replicated. But what if it can't? What if the Sanguis Rex bloodline is the only one capable of true integration?" Dimitri's hand found hers, his touch steady despite the tremor of uncertainty she caught in his psychic presence. "Then we adapt. We find other ways to build bridges between our worlds. Or we discover that some bridges can't be built," Irina countered with characteristic bluntness. "Elena, what you've achieved is remarkable, but it required a perfect storm of circumstances, ancient bloodline, mystical castle, life-or-death crisis, and the presence of both holy and vampiric power. Most supernatural beings won't have access to those conditions." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dawn air seeping through the castle walls. She had been so focused on proving that coexistence was possible that she hadn't fully considered whether it was practical. The synthesis she'd achieved might be unique to her circumstances, making her less a proof of concept than a beautiful anomaly. Marcus, ever pragmatic, voiced what they were all thinking. "We need a test case. Someone else who's willing to attempt integration under controlled conditions. If Elena's method works for others, we move forward. If it doesn't, then I become the exception that proves the rule," Elena finished. The possibility settled over her like a lead blanket. She could envision herself as a living symbol of what supernatural beings could become, forever unable to share that transformation with others. A bridge that could only span the gap for herself. "There's another option," Father Santos said slowly, his theological training evident in the way he approached the problem. "Elena, your ability to synthesize opposing natures might not be about replicating your specific transformation. It might be about developing new forms of integration that work for different bloodlines, different species, different circumstances." Elena looked up sharply, her medical background immediately grasping the implications. "You're talking about personalized treatment protocols, finding the specific combination of factors that allows each individual to achieve their own form of synthesis." "Exactly." Father Santos's eyes held the first spark of genuine enthusiasm she'd seen from him. The Inquisitor archives contain detailed records of supernatural bloodlines going back centuries. If we approach this methodically, identify the unique characteristics of each lineage, develop targeted integration techniques. "We'd need volunteers," Dmitri warned. "Supernatural beings willing to risk their lives in experimental procedures with no guarantee of success. And human participants willing to work with them," Marcus added. "Hunters, inquisitors, civilian authorities who can serve as bridges from the other side." Elena felt her pulse quicken as the scope of what they were proposing became clear. Not a simple proof of concept, but a comprehensive research initiative that could take decades to complete. The trauma nurse in her recognized the familiar rhythm of systematic medical advancement, careful studies, incremental progress, building a foundation of evidence one case at a time. But they didn't have decades. Marcus's hunter-gathering was in 3 weeks. Active kill orders were already in circulation. While they developed their careful methodologies, beings were dying. "We need both approaches," she said suddenly. "Long-term research for sustainable integration, but also immediate intervention to stop the killing. I can attend the hunter-gathering, not to convert everyone instantly, but to buy time for the research to develop." "Elena, no." Dmitri's voice carried centuries of protective instinct. "Walking into a gathering of supernatural hunters, even with allies, is beyond dangerous. It's suicidal. So is doing nothing while people die." Elena turned to face him fully, letting him see the resolution in her eyes. "This is what I trained for, Dmitri. Trauma medicine isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about stopping the immediate bleeding while you work toward permanent healing." Around the Great Hall, she could feel the weight of decisions settling over their unlikely alliance. The comfortable planning phase was ending, replaced by the moment when theories would be tested against reality. The final test wasn't just about proving integration was possible. It was about proving they could maintain their principles when the stakes became real. The castle's ancient stones seemed to shudder as Elena's declaration hung in the air. Through the tall windows, she could see storm clouds gathering again over the Cascade Mountains, as if nature itself sensed the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. 3 weeks, Marcus said grimly, checking his watch. "That's how long we have before the hunter-gathering. If Elena's really going to do this—" His words were cut off by a sound that made Elena's newly awakened vampire senses scream in warning. The rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air, multiple aircraft approaching fast. Dmitri moved to the window with inhuman speed, his expression darkening as he scanned the sky. 8 helicopters, military configuration. "They've found us." "Impossible," Father Santos breathed. "The castle exists outside normal space. No mortal technology should be able to locate it." Elena felt ice form in her stomach as realization struck. Unless they're not using normal technology. She turned to Marcus, seeing her fear reflected in his eyes. "You said there were other hunters. What if some of them have supernatural backing?" The lead helicopter crested the tree line, and Elena could see figures rappelling down even before it touched the castle's courtyard. But these weren't ordinary hunters. She could sense something wrong about them, something that made her synthesis nature recoil in instinctive recognition of an ancient enemy. "Nephilim," Irina whispered, her usual composure cracking. Angel-human hybrids. They've been the hunter's secret weapon for centuries, but I thought they were extinct. The castle's great doors exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Through the smoking entrance strode a figure that seemed to bend light around itself, tall, imposing, with features that were almost human but somehow too perfect, too sharp. Its eyes held the cold fire of divine judgment, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made the ancient stones ring. Dmitri Corvain, the being announced, its gaze sweeping over their assembled group. By decree of the celestial court and the mortal authorities they guide, you are charged with corruption of the natural order. The abomination you have created, its burning gaze fixed on Elena, must be cleansed before it spreads its poison further. Elena felt her hybrid nature respond to the threat with a surge of power that dwarfed anything she'd experienced before. The holy fire that had forged her synthesis blazed to life again, but this time it carried the protective fury of both her human compassion and her vampiric strength. "I'm not an abomination," she said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "I'm proof that your war doesn't have to continue." The Nephilim's laughter was like breaking crystal. "You are proof that mortals meddle in forces beyond their comprehension. The order between light and darkness, predator and prey, has existed since creation began. Your existence threatens the fundamental structure of reality itself." More figures poured through the shattered entrance, hunters armed with weapons that hummed with supernatural energy, inquisitors whose holy symbols blazed with light that hurt to look at directly, and behind them all, a presence that made Elena's blood freeze in recognition. Marcus stepped into view, but this wasn't the conflicted hunter who had found redemption hours ago. His eyes held the flat certainty of absolute faith, and when he looked at Elena, she saw no trace of the man who had chosen mercy over duty. "Elena Vasquez," he said in a voice devoid of warmth, "I thank you for making this easy. Your corruption of Father Santos and his inquisitors has revealed sympathizers who might have remained hidden for years." Horror crashed over Elena as she realized the scope of the trap. The synthesis, the alliance, Marcus's apparent redemption, all of it had been orchestrated to draw out supernatural beings and their human allies in one place where they could be eliminated together. "You're right about one thing," the Nephilim continued, raising a weapon that seemed forged from crystallized starlight. "This war doesn't have to continue. It will end today, with your destruction and the purification of all those you've corrupted." Elena felt Dmitri move to shield her, saw Irina bare fangs that gleamed like silver knives, watched Father Santos raise holy symbols that blazed with protective light. But she also felt the terrible mathematics of the situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemies who had prepared specifically for their unique abilities. The comfortable castle that had been their sanctuary was becoming their tomb. The alliance that had seemed like salvation was revealed as an elaborate execution, and the synthesis she had achieved, the proof that coexistence was possible, was about to be snuffed out before it could spread to a single other soul. But as the Nephilim's weapon began to charge with celestial fire, Elena felt something unexpected rising within her hybrid nature. Not despair, but defiance. Not acceptance, but rage at the cosmic injustice of it all. She had spent her career fighting death itself. She wasn't about to surrender now. The crystalline weapon in the Nephilim's hands pulsed with gathering power, each pulse sending waves of celestial fire that made the castle's ancient stones crack and smoke. Elena felt the wrongness of that light against her hybrid nature, not the warm illumination of the holy fire that had forged her synthesis, but the cold radiance of absolute judgment that recognized no possibility of redemption. Around her, she could feel her allies preparing for a battle they couldn't win. Dmitri's vampiric strength, formidable as it was, meant nothing against beings who had been created specifically to destroy his kind. Irina's centuries of cunning and survival instinct were useless when facing enemies who could predict every supernatural tactic. Father Santos's holy power was a candle flame against the bonfire of Nephilim righteousness. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They would all die here, and with them would die the proof that coexistence was possible. The synthesis she had achieved would become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying cosmic order. Unless... Elena felt the terrible clarity that came in the trauma bay when conventional treatments failed and only desperate measures remained. She had one advantage that her enemies hadn't accounted for. The very nature that made them consider her an abomination also made her unpredictable. Her synthesis existed outside the established rules of supernatural warfare. "Dmitri," she whispered, her voice carrying the absolute authority she'd learned when delivering life or death instructions in the ER. "When I give the signal, take Irina and Father Santos and run. Don't look back. Don't try to help me." She felt his shock ripple through their psychic connection. "Elena, whatever you're considering, the research we discussed, the long-term integration protocols, someone needs to survive to continue that work." She kept her voice steady even as her heart shattered. "You all need to survive." The Nephilim's weapon reached critical charge, reality itself beginning to warp around its crystalline point. Elena could see the future unfolding, the devastating blast that would reduce them all to ash, the triumphant report sent to hunter networks worldwide, the acceleration of extermination campaigns now that the threat of supernatural cooperation had been eliminated. She thought of every patient she'd lost, despite her best efforts. Every time death had won, despite her desperate interventions. Not this time. Elena stepped forward, spreading her arms wide, placing herself directly between her allies and the assembled hunters. But instead of fighting against the Nephilim's power, she opened herself to it, not to be destroyed, but to redirect it through her hybrid nature. "Elena, no!" Dimitri's anguished cry echoed through the great hall. The celestial fire struck her with the force of a falling star, but instead of annihilation, Elena felt something unprecedented happen. Her synthesis nature absorbed the attack, transforming the cold judgment into something new. The holy fire that had forged her integration blazed to life again, but now it carried the amplified power of Nephilim radiance, channeled through her unique ability to bridge opposing forces. The pain was beyond description. Elena felt her consciousness fracturing as divine power, meant to destroy supernatural beings, instead merged with her vampiric heritage. Every cell in her body became a battleground between creation and destruction, order and chaos, light and darkness. But she held on, using every technique she'd learned for managing pain and shock during medical procedures. The transformation rippled outward from her position, and Elena realized with growing horror what her sacrifice was truly costing. The synthesis that had made her special, that had allowed her to exist as both human and vampire, it was burning away, consumed as fuel to contain and redirect the Nephilim's attack. She felt her vampiric abilities dissolving first, the enhanced senses, the supernatural strength, the psychic connection to Dmitri. Then her human memories began to blur, her medical training, her childhood, her identity as Elena Vasquez, all becoming hazy and uncertain. But the redirected energy was having the intended effect. The light blazing from her position wasn't the cold radiance of judgment, but the warm illumination of her original holy fire, now amplified beyond anything she'd previously achieved. It swept over the assembled hunters and their Nephilim leaders, not destroying them but forcing them to experience what she had experienced. The moment of choice between perpetual war and possible peace. Through her fading consciousness, Elena could see Marcus staggering backward, his false memories cracking as the true version of his redemption reasserted itself. The Nephilim commander's perfect features contorted with something that might have been doubt. The hunters lowered their weapons, confusion replacing certainty. "Run," she whispered, though she was no longer sure if she spoke aloud or through their connection. "Please, make this matter." Elena felt Dimitri's desperate presence at the edge of her awareness, felt his anguish as he realized what she was giving up. but she also felt him making the hardest choice a leader could make, saving what could be saved instead of dying in a futile gesture. As her consciousness faded, Elena's last thought was a prayer that someone would remember what she had proven was possible, even if she could no longer remember it herself. The first thing Elena became aware of was silence, not the absence of sound, but the profound stillness that follows a storm. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy as she struggled toward consciousness, fragments of memory floating just beyond her grasp like half-remembered dreams. Warmth surrounded her, not the blazing fire that had consumed her during the confrontation, but something gentler, the soft press of blankets, the steady rhythm of breathing nearby, the faint scent of herbs and healing balm that reminded her of something important that remained frustratingly elusive. When she finally managed to open her eyes, Elena found herself in a room she didn't recognize. Stone walls rose around her, softened by tapestries that seemed ancient yet lovingly maintained. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting dancing patterns across the floor. Everything felt familiar yet foreign, like returning to a childhood home after decades away. "You're awake." The voice was rich, melodious, touched with an accent that sent unexpected shivers down her spine. Elena turned her head, a movement that required more effort than it should have, to find a man sitting beside her bed. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes the color of winter storms, beautiful in a way that seemed almost inhuman. Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. Who are you?" Pain flickered across the stranger's perfect features, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "My name is Dmitri. I've been caring for you since—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Since you were injured." Elena tried to sit up, her body protesting every movement. Dmitri moved to help her, his touch gentle but oddly cold. As his hands steadied her, she felt a strange flutter of recognition, not memory exactly, but something deeper, an echo of connection that made no logical sense. "Where am I?" she asked, accepting the glass of water he offered. The liquid was pure and cold, tasting faintly of mountain springs. "My home," Dmitri replied. "You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days. Elena searched her mind for any recollection of how she'd come to be here, but found only fragments, flashes of light, the sound of helicopters, a crushing sense of loss she couldn't explain. The harder she tried to remember, the more the memories seemed to slip away. Was I in an accident? The question felt important somehow, weighted with significance she couldn't grasp. Dmitri's expression grew carefully neutral. Something like that. "You saved a great many lives, but the effort, it took something from you." Before Elena could ask what he meant, the door opened to admit 2 more figures, an elderly priest with kind eyes and a younger man whose face bore faint scars. Both looked at her with a mixture of relief and barely concealed grief. "Elena," the priest said softly, approaching the bed with reverent care. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," she admitted. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember any of you." "Father Santos," he provided gently, "and this is Marcus. We're friends, people who care about you very much." The word friends seemed insufficient somehow, carrying an undertone of deeper bonds that Elena couldn't access. She looked between the 3 men, noting the way they watched her, protective, sorrowful, as if she were something precious that had been irreparably damaged. "What happened to me?" she asked directly. "And please don't say an accident again. I can tell there's more to this." Marcus stepped forward, his scarred features etched with guilt. "You made a choice, a sacrifice that saved all of us, but the cost—" He looked to Dmitri, who nodded slightly. "You were unique, Elena, special in ways that made you incredibly powerful. That power is gone now." "What kind of power?" Even as Elena asked, part of her recoiled from the question. Something deep inside her whispered that some knowledge was better left buried. "The kind that could have changed the world," Father Santos said quietly. "The kind that proved impossible things were possible." Elena felt tears she couldn't explain gathering in her eyes. "And now?" "Now you're human," Dmitri said, his voice carefully controlled, completely, purely human, free from burdens that were perhaps too great for any one person to carry. The words should have been comforting, but Elena felt only loss, a grief for something she couldn't remember having. She looked at these three men who claimed to care for her, seeing in their faces a story she couldn't access. Whatever had connected them, whatever she had been to them, it lived now only in their memories. "Will you tell me?" she asked finally. "About who I was? About what happened?" Dmitri reached out slowly, covering her hand with his. His touch was gentle, reverential, holding echoes of devotion that made her heart ache. "When you're ready," he promised. "When you're strong enough. For now, just focus on healing." Elena nodded, settling back against the pillows. Outside the window, she could hear birds singing, the sound of wind through ancient trees. Whatever she had lost, whatever price she had paid, life continued. As the days passed in Dmitri's castle, Elena found herself growing stronger, not just physically, but in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The story of her lost power, her sacrifice, was revealed to her in careful fragments, each piece adding to a portrait of a woman she couldn't remember being but somehow recognized as herself. She learned that she had been a trauma nurse in Portland, that she had fled into these mountains to escape a stalker, that she had discovered worlds beyond human understanding. The men who cared for her filled in the gaps with patience and obvious love, never pushing her to remember more than she could handle. But it was the small moments that felt most real, the way Dmitri's eyes lit up when she laughed at something Father Santos said, the relief in Marcus's face when she asked questions about their shared past, the reverent way they all treated her presence as a gift they'd nearly lost forever. "I want to go home," she announced one morning over breakfast, the words surprising even her. Not to remember, just to start again. The silence that followed was profound. When she looked up from her tea, she found all three men watching her with expressions of carefully controlled devastation. "Of course," Dmitri said finally, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Whatever you need." 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the doorway of her Portland apartment, keys heavy in her hand. Marcus had arranged for her belongings to be returned, her job to be held open under medical leave. Father Santos had provided documentation that satisfied the authorities' questions about her disappearance. Dmitri had simply stood nearby, saying nothing, radiating a grief so profound she felt it in her bones. The apartment felt foreign despite being filled with her possessions. Photos on the wall showed a life she couldn't access, though sometimes holding certain objects, a stethoscope, a coffee mug from a medical conference. She felt whispers of the woman she'd been. "Will I see you again?" she asked, as her three guardians prepared to leave. "If you want to," Dmitri replied, though something in his tone suggested he didn't expect she would. But Elena found, as the weeks passed, that she did want to, not because she remembered their connection, but because something new was growing between them, different from whatever had come before but no less meaningful. She began having lunch with Father Santos, discussing philosophy and faith with a perspective that surprised them both. She met Marcus for coffee, drawn to his stories of redemption and second chances. And Dmitri, she invited to walk with her through the city parks, finding in his presence a peace she couldn't explain. He never presumed upon their lost intimacy, never tried to recreate what had been, but something was rebuilding itself between them. Tentative, careful, real. When she returned to work at the hospital, Elena discovered that she was different in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural abilities. The compassion that had once been instinctive now felt like a conscious choice, harder to access but more intentional when she found it. She worked with patients who reminded her that impossible things happened every day, recoveries that defied medical explanation, moments of grace that transcended understanding. "You're different," a supervisor noted during her first evaluation back. "Quieter, but there's something, I can't put my finger on it, like you've seen more than most people." Elena smiled, thinking of the men who visited her regularly, who carried the weight of impossible memories she could no longer share. I think I have. 6 months after her return, Elena stood in her apartment's kitchen, preparing dinner for 4. It had become a tradition, these gatherings where they talked about everything except the past she couldn't remember. Tonight felt different, though. Special. When the knock came, she opened the door to find Dmitri holding a small bouquet of wildflowers that made her heart stutter with inexplicable recognition. "These are beautiful," she said, accepting them with hands that trembled slightly. "They're from the castle gardens," he replied softly. I hoped you might like them." As she arranged the flowers in a vase, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the window and was struck by how different she looked from the photos on her walls. The woman in those pictures had been running from something. The woman looking back at her now had found something instead, not the life she'd lost, but the life she was choosing to build. When Father Santos and Marcus arrived, they found her laughing at something Dmitri had said, the sound bright and unguarded. The grief that had shadowed all their faces for months was still there, but underneath it was something new, hope. "Tell me about the work you're doing," Elena said as they sat down to eat. "The real work, the important work." They exchanged glances, these men who had loved different versions of her. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked gently. Elena nodded, reaching across the table to take Dmitri's hand. "I may not remember who I was, but I know who I am now, and I think she would want to help too." Dmitri's fingers tightened around hers, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. Not the careful hope he'd worn for months, but genuine surprise tinged with wonder. "The work began as necessity," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "After everything that happened, the old ways of existing became impossible. Hunters and supernatural beings had seen what cooperation could achieve. Your sacrifice forced us all to imagine something different." Father Santos leaned forward, his weathered hands wrapped around his wineglass. "Elena, what you accomplished in those final moments. It didn't just save our lives, it planted seeds in minds that had never considered alternatives to endless war. Seeds that are growing," Marcus added, his scarred features animated with an enthusiasm she'd rarely seen from him. "Hunter networks that once operated on pure elimination protocols are now requesting consultation on containment and rehabilitation. Supernatural communities are establishing councils to self-regulate instead of hiding in isolation." Elena absorbed this, feeling a strange resonance in her chest, like an echo of purpose she couldn't quite grasp. "And you're all working together on this?" "We've become something unprecedented," Dmitri explained. "A bridge between worlds that have been enemies for millennia. Father Santos provides moral framework and theological legitimacy. Marcus offers credibility with hunter organizations. I represent the older supernatural powers who remember when coexistence was possible. But it's fragile," Father Santos admitted. "Every day brings new challenges. Communities that resist change. Hardliners on both sides who see cooperation as betrayal. We need—" He paused, looking at her with careful intensity. "We need someone who understands healing. Someone who can see the humanity in everyone." Elena felt her heart racing, though she wasn't sure why. "What exactly are you asking me?" "To be yourself," Marcus said simply. "To bring the same compassion you show your patients to this larger healing. You may not remember being a bridge between supernatural worlds, but you're still a bridge between human suffering and human hope." She looked around the table at these 3 remarkable men who had somehow become central to her reconstructed life. Each carried scars from the battles she couldn't remember. Each had been transformed by experiences she could only imagine. Yet here they sat, asking her, ordinary, human her, to join something extraordinary. "I would travel," Dmitri said softly, "between the castle and wherever we're needed. Council meetings, mediation sessions, investigation of incidents that require delicate handling. I could set up a permanent residence here in Portland, if that would make you more comfortable." The offer hung in the air, laden with implications that went far beyond professional collaboration. Elena studied Dmitri's face, seeing in his carefully controlled expression the depth of feeling he worked so hard to contain. Not pressure or expectation, but patient devotion that asked for nothing beyond what she was willing to give. "This woman I was before," Elena said slowly. "The one who made the sacrifice. What would she have wanted?" "She wanted to prove that impossible things were possible," Father Santos replied. "That love could transcend the boundaries between different kinds of beings. That redemption was always within reach, no matter how lost someone seemed." Elena thought of her patients, the addicts and criminals and broken souls who passed through her trauma bay. She thought of the moments when medical intervention became ministry, when healing required more than technical skill. She thought of the inexplicable peace she felt in Dimitri's presence, the way Marcus's guilt had transformed into purposeful action, the quiet wisdom Father Santos offered without judgment. "When would we start?" she asked. The question seemed to electrify the air around the table. Dimitri's breath caught audibly. Marcus's scarred face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Father Santos made a small sound that might have been a prayer of gratitude. "Tomorrow, if you're willing," Dimitri said. "There's a situation in Seattle, a young vampire who attacked a hunter's family. Both communities are calling for blood. We've been asked to mediate." Elena nodded, feeling something click into place inside her chest. "Then we'll go to Seattle." As the evening wound down, as Father Santos and Marcus prepared to leave with plans to meet her at the castle the next morning, Elena found herself standing on her apartment balcony with Dimitri. The Portland skyline glittered below them, a testament to humanity's endless capacity to build something beautiful from chaos. "Are you afraid?" Dimitri asked quietly. "Of what we're undertaking?" Elena considered the question, watching the city lights blur into stars. "No," she realized. "I lost everything once and survived. I lost myself and found someone new. I think I can handle whatever comes next." Dimitri moved closer, not touching but offering his presence like a gift. "The woman you were would be proud of the woman you've become." Elena smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that healing was always possible. Tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. "Let's go save the world," she said.